Hey guys, it's Alexandra. So, unfortunately, mass shootings have been, an increasing topic of conversation in the news lately. And I think anytime things like this happen, it's a really hard discussion to have. So, I hope that you will come into this interview with an open mind. And we are going to be hearing from Anthony, who is a firearms instructor. He's going to be giving his 2 cents into, the argument for and against guns. We're going to be talking about the media's portrayal of mass shootings, how social media factors into this, and I hope that you will stay tuned to learn something new, and you can also subscribe for more videos. All right, thank you so much.
So I'm listening to the Spanish news while enjoying a cigar and having a drink, and they're talking about how there's been more than 45 mass shootings in the last month. Now, I'd like to bring attention to, I do believe it was the 90s, when there was massive mainstream media coverage of suicides, which led to what are called copycat suicides, where people who were already contemplating suicide saw media coverage of suicides, and they decided to actually go through with it, and ended up actually committing suicide. These copycat suicides contributed to a massive epidemic of suicides due to media coverage in the 90s. As a result, there was a kind of de facto plan put in place, which was that the media was no longer going to glorify and cover suicides in order to prevent copycat suicides and deal with the epidemic. When the media stopped covering the suicides, the amount of suicides in the United States actually went down by removing those copycat suicides. I'm surprised we haven't decided to do that with the media coverage of mass shootings. Here's a common misconception about gun owners that people actually think is true. Whenever people think about gun owners, they think that we're some bloodthirsty people that wake up in the morning and the only thing that we have on our minds is murder and taking the lives of people. Theoretically speaking, if you remove guns from the criminals, yes, the criminals will no longer be able to use guns in crime. However, they're still able to commit crime and they will still continue to commit crime, so you basically did not solve the root cause of the problem. I really, really want to have some deep conversations and discourse with all of you. A majority of you only give a fuck when the media tells you to give a fuck. You only give a fuck when social media tells you to give a fuck. You don't actually give a fuck. That's all.
Unfortunately, when mass shootings happen, the conversation about gun control resurfaces. I feel like it, goes in and out of being a topic of debate, but with recent events, more and more people have been focusing on the argument of, I feel as just a viewer of news, that there's a strong divide between people saying standing with the Second Amendment, and then people saying no, like guns are the death of this country, we should get rid of all guns. I feel like it's a very polarized debate. And I felt like you gave, I don't see usually a lot of strong evidence to the arguments. They're usually just a lot of loud voices from either end. So it's interesting to hear the actual context of it and to feel like, I feel like you're at least educating and you're giving a lot of factual information. So I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's also an interesting perspective. You're a firearms instructor, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Yes. So can you talk a little bit about what you do?
I'm a NRA certified instructor. I kind of wanted to get into teaching beginners about firearms, and so I got my NRA certification, which is used in Florida to basically certify people to get the concealed carry permit through the state. And so with that, I mostly train people on pistol because that's mostly what people conceal carry. However, sometimes I do kind of, more private courses where I teach people, kind of rifle and shotgun and type of shooting. And so that's kind of my main focus. I know that there's people out there that do more advanced level kind of home defense type stuff, but I try to focus more on beginners because when I was a beginner, which was not all that long ago, actually, maybe a couple of years, I felt like all the instructors that are out there are kind of, we lovingly call them in the community tactical, right? Like everybody wants to be like, SEAL Team 6 or like SWAT teams, right? Like everybody wants to be tactical, like tactical, like tactical, right? And so that's kind of what you get from most instructors. So I wanted to be kind of more of an instructor that's more down to earth. I'm just like you, right? The difference is that I know how to handle guns. I'm going to share that knowledge with you, and hopefully you get something meaningful out of it. Is effectively what I try to focus on in terms of firearms instruction.
So when things like mass shootings start coming up in the news again, and you are hearing a lot about people saying, how can how can anyone possibly support the Second Amendment when people are dying? What is your rebuttal to that?
I mean, before I rebuttal, I mean, you have to understand where those people are coming from. People are dying. That's a fact, right? Um, and there's evil people out there that are, sick, and they are using firearms to make their sick, twisted desires come to life, right? They want to take human life, and they're going to do that with firearms. So when people say, how could anyone support the Second Amendment? I used to be one of them. So I get where they're coming from, right? Watching the loss of life repeatedly, day after day on the news, makes you feel a certain way. And if you don't feel a certain way, then I mean, I don't know what to tell you, right? If when you hear that someone loses their life, you should, as a human being, feel kind of sad and a little impacted by it, right? Someone was alive and now they're not. Um, so usually I try not to rebuttal, because that's what I've seen has been a major problem in the Second Amendment community, right? People that are pro Second Amendment, or people that are, for example, pro gun, which means you're not exactly pro no gun legislation. You believe in some what people call reasonable restrictions. That's what I would call pro gun versus pro Second Amendment. Um, like you said earlier, on one side, you have people that are like, how could you believe that people have a right to own AR-15s or AK-47s? And on the other side, I've talked about this. We have the people that are like, shall not be infringed, shall not be infringed. And that's all they say. And they're just, trying to insult people, and, trying to belittle people for having an opinion that's different from theirs. And both sides are guilty of that. So I think we need to get away from rebuttals. So when I hear people, see a piece of news and they feel a certain way, it's not necessarily in line with what I think. I think I want to talk to them. I want to sit down and say, "Hey, how do you feel about this?" Right? What do you think the problem is? And based on what that person thinks the problem is, let's come up with a solution that works for you and it works for me. I'm pro Second Amendment. Let's come up with a solution that's a good compromise of what you feel is necessary to solve this problem, and at the same time it respects the Second Amendment. And a lot of people don't want to have that conversation. They can't get past that initial, how could anyone support owning AR-15s or AK-47s, or what people call, weapons of war or assault rifles, when these terms are technically incorrect. And people kind of stick on that. And I'm like, no, let's talk about the actual issue. People are losing their lives. There's a massive majority of individuals who feel that firearms are the problem. Let's talk about that. And let's come up with a solution that works for both groups.
Right. And how do you think the way that the media talks about mass shootings perpetuates those arguments?
Um, it feels like the media, by majority, it kind of feels like in this country we have more liberal media than we do conservative media, and we have very little neutral media at all, because neutral media doesn't sell ad spaces, it doesn't sell commercials, it doesn't make money, right? We have to understand that at the end of the day, media is business, and the point of a business is to make money. Anyone that's ever been out there knows that if you start a business, you're hoping to make some kind of money out of it. And news outlets are no different. And I think the major problem is that, for example, you'll see Fox News bring people like Colion Noir, who's pro Second Amendment, bring him on and make a whole argument of how people are going to use this that just happened to take away our Second Amendment rights. Flip the channel to CNN. Here we have this doctor who's an expert in shotgun wounds, who's going to talk about why AR-15s are horrible and we should ban them. Right. And so on both sides, what you end up with is an incredibly polarized form of information. It's framed in a certain way to make you feel a certain way. So you tune in again, right? Because, anyone who's gone to college usually takes some kind of psychology class. At least I've seen that's kind of a major requirement throughout Florida, is you have to take a psychology class. So you learn about confirmation bias, right? And for those that don't know what confirmation bias is, it effectively means that you're more likely to accept information that reinforces what you already believe, and you're less likely to accept information that goes against what you believe. So if you're pro Second Amendment, you're more likely to tune into Fox day after day after day because you like to hear people reinforcing what you believe. Same thing on the other side. If you're against the Second Amendment, you're more likely to listen to CNN because they're reinforcing what you believe. And they prey on that. They know that you're going to tune in, you're going to watch 5 minutes of commercials, and they're going to make millions of dollars off of people like you that continue to tune in. And Fox is guilty of that. CNN is guilty of that. Conservatives and liberals are guilty of that. I think that there's no good guy in this story. And the people who end up losing are people like you and myself, are just the regular Joe Schmo people that don't have anything to do with it. And then we end up losing our liberties or suffering due to bad policy, whatever that might be, at the hands of effectively what amounts to individuals who are more concerned with making money than they are with telling the truth.
Right. And what do you notice the most about the misconceptions of being pro Second Amendment and pro gun? Can you talk a little bit more about the difference between those two things?
Yeah, so just kind of a quick recap. If you're pro Second Amendment, there's kind of a phrase that we use in pro Second Amendment. It basically means that all gun laws are infringements, meaning all gun laws are violations of the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment, I know it sounds crazy because I literally said earlier that most people just say shall not be infringed, but right, we have to understand the language of the Constitution because we are a constitutional republic, which means everything that we do as a country goes to that Constitution. So the language states the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, so if we look at the historical context of what that means, right, we look at the Old English from that time, from that era. Infringe means to reduce, to alter, to change, to remove, to destroy, right? So any gun law that says, for example, you cannot have a magazine that is more than 10 rounds, that's a gun law, right? That's an infringement. The pro Second Amendment people would have that kind of logic. A pro-gun person says you have a right to keep and bear arms, but a 10-round magazine limitation is reasonable. Versus the pro-Second Amendment person would turn that down and say, no, that's not reasonable. Because, again, the language of our Constitution, which is the very basis of our government, states that you cannot infringe, you cannot limit, you cannot reduce, you cannot change the people's right to keep and bear arms. That's the language. So that's kind of the main difference.
Right. So how do you respond or, have a conversation with, if you're able to, people that will argue that that's very outdated and we shouldn't keep referencing that and things need to evolve?
There's a popular argument. Some people get mad at it, but sadly, I think it's a very accurate argument. Most people are saying this on social media. There was no social media when the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution of the United States was written. Are we going to start writing to each other with quill and ink on parchment and waiting 30 days for someone to bring the letters on horseback? Because, I mean, at that point, the entire Constitution's outdated, and we should throw out the First Amendment right to free speech or the First Amendment right to a free press. So someone like you, who's an independent journalist, effectively, right? Sorry, you don't get to do this because you're doing it on Zoom. Right, we're having this conversation on Zoom over a computer. These things did not exist back when the Constitution was written. Or the right to peaceably protest, right? People will communicate over digital means, right? Over phones, social media, and stuff like that to organize massive protests that would have never been seen when this country was founded because communication was way slower. And so we cannot say that the Second Amendment is outdated, but then say that the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment or the Fifth Amendment or the Sixth Amendment are still valid. Because in that case, if the Second Amendment is outdated, then so is the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. That's over 150 years old. Let's just get rid of that. That's old. Let's change that. No, like, they're there. They were agreed upon effectively. I don't think anyone would argue that the freedom of speech is a bad thing, or that the freedom of protesting is a bad thing, or that the right to privacy under the Fourth Amendment is a bad thing. But somehow the Second Amendment is where everybody wants to make concessions. And once you start to welcome concessions, you're opening up the door for bad things. So there, the age old saying of you give them an inch, but they take a mile,
Right.
right? That is the case, and we don't just see that with the Second Amendment. I mean, if anyone who's kind of keeps an eye on public policy, the people of this country have been giving inches all over the place in many regards outside the scope of this interview, and we've lost miles. And anyone, if I tell them that, any single person will be able to think of at least 1, 2, maybe 3 things that they feel were inches they gave and they got miles taken in terms of public policy. For me, that's, for example, the Second Amendment. We could get into COVID restrictions, for example, right? Again, outside the scope of the interview, but we could get into that, right? And I think we made concessions and they took more than we were willing to give. Whatever that means to people, it means a certain thing to me, right? And so I don't think we can consider these things outdated. Now, if you want, because the thing is that when people say it's outdated, it's really that they want to change it. Well, say that you want to change it and let's have that conversation, but don't say, oh, it's outdated. Like, what are you trying to say? Right? Say what you mean so that we can actually have an honest conversation. I think people have a hard time being honest about these sensitive, polarizing topics. So they try to find different ways to kind of wiggle into what they actually hope to do. And I think when people say outdated, I think they really just want to talk about the possibility of altering the Second Amendment or making changes. Honestly, I think that's what it is.
And especially I feel when, racial injustice and police brutality come into the picture, how do you think that, plays into the whole gun discussion?
Honestly, I feel like I don't even see people make comparisons or tie the two things together. For example, if, total hypothetical, right? Constitutionally, we have a right to keep and bear arms, right? This is an individual right. In 2008, the Supreme Court ruled in the Supreme Court case of DC versus Heller that we, in fact, have an individual right to keep and bear arms. They also ruled that it's not unlimited, which I disagree with, but that's not the point, right? The point is that they ruled that we have an individual right, which means if the police pulls over a person and that person has a gun and the police draws their gun and shoots the person, for example, in a hypothetical, then the argument being made on the internet now, which I kind of agree with, is if that's the case, then how can you say we have a right to keep and bear arms if the police's first instinct is to draw their gun on you just because you have one? Shouldn't the first instinct be, oh, we live in the United States, people have a right to keep and bear arms, this person having a gun is a perfectly normal part of our society, right? But people don't even think about that. I'm bringing that up now because you said, hey, what about police brutality and guns and racial injustice? But most people are not even having that conversation. I feel like most people are like super loud, like barking dogs when it comes to injustices, right? Racially or in terms of law enforcement. And then for them, guns and the Second Amendment and stuff like that is an entirely different issue. But since you brought it up, what are both things kind of related with? Because I think like we could find some common ground, right? More conservative individuals and more liberal individuals could find some common ground in that all these topics have to do with a singular concept that's incredibly important to us as Americans: liberty. Racial injustice, police brutality, and the right to keep and bear arms are different, but they're all slightly tied together because of the common thread of liberty.
Yeah. And I think, it's an interesting point that you bring up, just the fact of like people sounding like they're not getting actually to the discussion and the honesty part. They're just getting, or, they're not able to interpret. And I'm guilty of this too, sometimes not being able to interpret what I actually want to say and thinking that I'm making a certain point by making, commentary that might be too broad, like saying, it's outdated, things like that, when what you're really saying is that you want to change a certain part of it. I think that's an important clarification to make. And I think, when these mass shootings happen and people are very emotional, I think an argument that comes up is, how do we solve this? How do we end gun violence in this country? So when people are, especially like you mentioned social media being a big, way that people are communicating about this. what is your reaction when people are, you know, on this mission or on this fight to end gun violence, and they, what is this solution? What do you think a solution is to this?
I honestly would not be able to pinpoint a solution. If I were to give you an answer right now, it's what I think, right?
Right.
But like I'll put this out there. I'm a PhD student, which means I'm active in academic research, and we're held to a very high standard of what we are allowed to say. We have to be able to back up what we say, because when we say things, we're trying to say that this isn't necessarily a fact, but there's a very high degree of certainty that it is,
Hmm.
right? And so in my good conscience, in my good conscience, I cannot say this is the solution, because I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, I'm doing a disservice to our society and our country and our people if I'm wrong. So I'm going to say that the following is the solution, because it's the fact, in my opinion, right? Which is kind of weird, but kind of oxymoronic. But it's the fact, in my opinion, is that the solution to gun violence is us being able to sit down at the table and have a discussion and be honest with each other and listen to one another. People don't sit there and wait for your turn to talk. It looks like you're listening, but you're actually just waiting for your turn to talk. And people are guilty of this. I'm guilty of this. Maybe you've been guilty of it sometimes, where you're having a debate with someone and you're just waiting for them to finish so you can get your thought in, but you're not actually listening to anything they're saying, right? Until we can't sit down at the table and have an honest discussion where we're listening to each other's worries and concerns and what we think are potential solutions, I don't think we're ever going to deal with something like gun violence, or outside the scope of the interview, right? Racial injustice, police brutality, anything you can think of that's a problem that our society is facing, that you might feel is a problem that our society is facing, will be solved the moment we as humans can sit down and have an honest discussion and listen to one another.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting because I just watched one of your videos recently about how, nobody seems to care about an issue until the media tells you you should care about that issue. And, when you are caring about that issue, you're not really caring about that issue. So if you want to jump more into that, I'd love to hear more of that perspective.
Um, Absolutely. I think, and this is crazy. I don't know how old you are, right? I was raised never to ask a lady her age, but I'm 25, right? So I was born in '95, and when I grew up, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no Snapchat, no TikTok, no Twitter, no nothing like that, right? And social interactions were all about just having a good time, right? Just having a good time, and just enjoying the company of other people. Social media came along, and now we have likes, thumbs up, star ratings, 5 stars, 3 stars, 2 stars. So effectively, and there's been massive studies, psychological and psychiatric studies done on this. But when someone hits like on your post and you see that you got a new like, there's a massive dopamine rush, right? It feels really good to get likes on your post. So we are addicted to dopamine. We're addicted to that rush we get when we get likes. And so suddenly our social interactions have become, I don't want to hang out with my friends in person, because I could make a post online, get 3,000 likes, and feel really good about it. And I wouldn't get that rush from hanging out with my friends. Sorry, not sorry, right? As some people would say. And so I think that has become a massive influential part in our society, because effectively, I don't know if you've heard the phrase clout chasing,
Yes.
right? Or chasing the general acceptance of the society, right? I want everyone to accept me. I want everyone to think I'm the best, the highest, above everyone, right? Clout chasing. As a result of us getting addicted to that dopamine rush we get when people hit the like button on our social media posts, when the media says, hey, this is a big deal, people are like, hey, if I back that narrative, people are going to think that I'm cool and I'm going to get clout. So it's a social version, a real life version of the thumbs up likes system. And most people are doing this kind of I'm backing the narrative on social media anyways. So they get the social real life dopamine hit, and they also get the social media hit from the likes that they're going to get on their post, because their post is in line with what the media is saying. And it's not only that, but for example, when I was growing up, as early as 5th grade, 6th grade, we were given current event assignments once a week where we had to find like 3 or 4 news articles, and they had to be news articles. And they had to be from like your local newspaper, because that was deemed to be a reliable source of information. And then you start to go through middle school and high school, and you have to do these research papers, and you have to write these essays, and always, oh, go look at news reports, because those are reliable sources of information. So our school system, right, and most of us I grew up watching my dad religiously watch the news every morning before work, come home from work, and watch the news at 6. So, who's calling me? It is. I'm in the middle of an interview. um, for me, growing up, I'm like, well, hey, listen, my dad's a smart guy. I want to be like my dad. My dad watches the news twice a day. So I'm going to watch the news. And then I go to school, and the school says, hey, this is a reliable source of information. So, what do you think happens when you tie those two things together? You take what the news says as fact, right? My own father sometimes tells me, how could they say that on the news if it's false? There's an implication in him saying that. The implication is that the news can only tell the truth. And I'm like, well, I mean, yes, they could be charged for lying, right? Or for spreading misinformation. That would be a bad look. So instead, what they do is framing. We're going to tell you the truth in a way that makes you feel a certain way, or makes you interpret the truth in a certain way that is beneficial to our general narrative. So you cannot tell us that we lied, because we told you the truth. But we still get you to believe what we want you to believe, because it brings you back every day. Make sure that you watch the ads, you click through to our articles, and we get those cents per click, and those cents per minute, those cents per views, right? Which is how news outlets make their money. Because for the most part, how many news outlets that you're familiar with right now are free? A lot of them, right? How many do you still have to pay for? Very few of them, right? And the ones that you have to pay for, you pay very little for like a yearly subscription, like $10. How much money is that news outlet actually making at that point, or that newspaper making at that point? Do they have enough to pay everybody that works for them? Is every journalist going to get fair pay for their work when you only paid $5 for an annual subscription? So how are they going to make money? Off the ads on their articles, which means they're going to be incentivized to use sensational thumbnails, article titles, for that first paragraph to really, really capture your attention and make you feel a certain way. And then at the end, they'll be like, stay tuned for updates. Now you're invested.
Right.
So there's like this whole massive thing that all ties together and keeps us kind of in that little, shall we say, rat race. The media outlet and social media rat race.
So in your own experience with social media and your own, accounts, what are you hoping, what kind of narrative are you hoping to set? Like, what do you hope people connect with as far as your content goes?
Honestly, I try to be forward about what I want. If I want you to like the Second Amendment and join me in being a Second Amendment supporter, I'm gonna tell you. It's on my page. It says Second Amendment advocate, firearms instructor. I try to put stuff in my bio so you know what I'm about. It's right there. And you're welcome to ask me. Be like, Anthony, what are you about? And I'll be like, this is what I'm about, honestly. Right. And like, I don't have ulterior motives. My motives are right there. I only have, if there's ulterior motives, I only have main motives. So my hope, mostly I've noticed, is
primarily the Second Amendment, but honestly, besides that, I don't think that the Second Amendment is the panacea, the cure-all for our problems. I think that I mostly want people to realize that they have an incredible personal responsibility to making sure that we make our communities, our states, and our country a better place. This is not about the government. This is about you and I. We're responsible for what happens. Because at the end of the day, the government is a small group of individuals that we all elected to do very specific jobs, and we're trying to tell them to cure homelessness, to feed everybody, to lower the price of medications, to make things more affordable, to provide us with a livable wage, right? Whether you agree with that or not, right? Like, doesn't matter, right? Like, I'm kind of giving a sample of different, liberal, conservative, and moderate ideas. And everybody looks at the government to provide that solution. And even conservatives are guilty because they say the solutions are not happening because the government is too big. You're still saying that the solution is tied to government.
Right.
You're still not saying, hey, what can I do to feed homeless people? Because I promise you, if we all did a little bit to feed homeless people, we could feed every single homeless person. We could build houses for homeless people. And we could possibly eradicate the homelessness crisis within a decade. If everybody donated $100, if you have it, or 10 if you don't, or maybe $5 or $1. There's 330 million people in this country. Can you imagine if we put together, let's say $5 a person, that's 5 times 330 million. That's a lot of money. And $5 is a Starbucks coffee that most people go and buy. Most people. Or we'll spend it on beer, right? Like a half decent beer will cost you $5 at a restaurant. So forego your beer for the month, one beer for the month, donate the $5. In a month, we could have several $1 billion that we could put towards building homes for the homeless and feeding those homeless and getting those people jobs, or getting those people the medical, psychological, or psychiatric care that they need. We did that, not the government. Never once did I mention, hey, let's ask the government for help. No, I said, hey, what can we do as a community? Let's band together. Let's come up with a plan and let's tackle it. Forget the government. The government's going to take forever to do it. They're going to take 3 years to pass a law, and then they're going to take 25 years, and they still will ask for more money because they couldn't do it in 25 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important. That's definitely interesting. I think that is one thing, I see a lot of people on both ends complaining about things that they think aren't going well or aren't fair. And I think it's interesting to have that point of view about, once you take that out of it and realize that, it's an internal thing that can be changed. I think that's important. So I appreciate you giving information that I feel I'm learning from and not, arguing with. So I think I appreciate that you have that tone to your content. I think that's, especially just from my experience on social media, that's very hard to come across. It seems to be very extreme one way or the other, and without a lot of explanation or, fact or education or credentials behind that. So, I do appreciate what you do, and I thank you for sharing your point of view with me.
Thank you. I mean, I am guilty of occasionally making the occasional TikTok where I mock people who make really stupid arguments against the Second Amendment, for example. And I'll just do a little bit of a mockery. I'll use the long face filter and be like, you shouldn't have a weapon of war. And then I try in that same video where I made a slight mockery of that individual who is just a general person. It's not anybody in specific. I try in that video to also provide an informational, educational, like tidbits of knowledge that show why that argument is wrong. So I try not to just do full-blown mockeries, which you find a lot of on TikTok, believe it or not. You go on TikTok and it's just like full mockery.
Definitely.
Like with no knowledge, no education, no nothing.
Yes, for sure. I think it's also easy to jump on the bandwagon of whatever people are saying, based on whatever current event is popular. I think, we feel, from my perspective, we feel this panic to like be included in something somehow, or like have our voice heard, or you know what I mean? Like you feel like you don't
Yeah, that's
count
true.
unless
Yeah,
you're
that's definitely
like
true.
got to jump in on it. And that's kind of dangerous because I think a lot of the things people are jumping in on, they don't really know about. They're just, hopping on the
Yeah.
train. So,
Yeah, now that you mention that, it's kind of like
excuse me.
we've gone so far away. It's cliche, but American rugged individualism. You hear that phrase sometimes, right? As Americans, we used to not care what anyone thought because we are an individualist country. We're not the collectivists. Yes, the collective is important, but who makes up the collective? It's the individuals that make up the collective. And so you need strong individuals, and a strong, independent person doesn't care about what the rest of the group thinks.
Right.
Sometimes you have to be willing to think different. And we've kind of, a lot of people have grown up now under this misguided concept that we have to be accepted. You must be accepted. And if you're not accepted, then you did something wrong. It's like, no, there's this huge movement of what is called political homelessness. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a libertarian from like the Libertarian Party.
Right.
I'm just an American who notices there are problems in this country, and it seems like no political party quite is cutting it
Yeah.
for what we need to do, which goes back to what George Washington said in his farewell address. And this is another issue, is that people don't study history very much. And the past informs the present and informs the future, right? There's so much we can learn from the past so that we don't repeat those same mistakes, right? And George Washington said in his farewell address to he didn't formally say don't do political parties. What he said was, do not let enemies from within and outside of the country divide you on things like ideology, on things like geography, on things like religion, right? So by that logic, don't let people divide you by political party. This ideology versus that ideology. This is right, that is wrong. It's like you're allowing yourself to be divided. He said, hey, listen, right now we just won the revolution and everyone's super excited. Everyone's on the same page. But years are going to pass and that fervor is going to wear off, right? And it's going to become a war of attrition, a slow, steady chipping away at the liberties of the American people. And it's going to be the job of the American people to hold a united front and defend those liberties from the enemies from within and from outside. They had just won a revolution and everyone was on the same page for the most part. And even then, the founders recognized that we weren't just going to have enemies outside. We we're going to have people within our own confines that were going to be trying to poison the well and to weaken our defense from within. Because the fact of the matter is that here's a problem, and it comes up pretty much in every single debate that happens, 2A included. It's the belief that we can somehow eradicate evil. We cannot eradicate evil. If evil could be eradicated, we would have had an earthly utopia for the last 25,000 millennia. The fact of the matter is, we will always have evil people, murderers, rapists, thieves, people that want to do ill upon others. And you'll never be able to get rid of that. So the best that we can do is just say, hey, who are the good people? Us. Okay, cool. Now, let's make sure that we work together. Let's make sure that we have a united front so that when the evil people show their faces, we can deal with them together. Because right now we're so busy bickering with one another, those evil people can just come around and stab everybody in the back because everyone's so busy arguing and bickering with one another that they can't see the guy with the knife. They can't see the guy pouring the massive bucket of poison inside the well because they're so busy bickering, right? And so I think moving forward, I think we really do need to try and be more like, hey, yeah, we don't agree 100%, but you're American, I'm American. We want what's best for this country. We don't necessarily know what the best solution is, but let's work together and try to find it. How about that? And just being like, yeah, let's do that. because I don't think we do that enough.
And I agree. And I think it's also hard when you're growing and you're learning. And I feel as if, if you feel like you belong somewhere and then you realize you might not completely belong there, you might relate to other areas as well. There's that fear to like, oh no, you need to cling on to what you know, you need to stick with what you are. And I think, people don't allow themselves enough to explore other mindsets and maybe look outside of yourself and decide that everything you think is right, someone else doesn't, it's not, I'm right, you're wrong. I feel like there's a lot of in between that people don't dig at that really could, if we were all able to look at all of that in between stuff and figure it out, we could maybe get further in, unifying the country. I think it's hard when you are so scared to look bad, or people make mistakes. It's okay to like, as it's one thing if you're looking bad and you're hurting a bunch of people, but I think if more people were able to just have these conversations, that could get us farther than we are, in my
No,
opinion.
absolutely. Like 110%. I think the problem is that we have a winner take all kind of mentality in this country,
Mhm.
right? And from a young age, you're taught that there is pass and there is fail. Sorry, you got less than a 70, you failed, right? Right? D's and F's are failures. You failed. If you get higher than that, you passed. But you have to get an A if you really, really want to pass, right? Or you win or you lose. And yes, there are parts of life where there are winners and losers, like, for example, in sports, but life is not a sport. Life is complicated. People grow up and they become adults and they realize, wow, everything's like black and white and a whole load of like inconsistent shades of gray somewhere in the middle. And it's like it's not even like a gradient, it's like splotches. And so it's just like super inconsistent. And then people don't want to have that those types of discussions because it's my hypothesis, right? It's my idea. It's because you are raised that you have to win. I have to win and you have to lose. And anything in between there is not it. And so when I say, well, guys, you have to compromise, they're like, oh, compromise? We're going to give an inch on the Second Amendment, for example, right? Kind of going back to the original topic. We're going to give an inch. I'm like, no, 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 no. When I say compromise, I literally just mean giving your time to listen to the other side and see what their concern is, because we have concerns. The people on the left, their underlying concern is that people are dying. Let's be honest, that's a concern. The concern of the people on the right is that our inalienable right to keep and bear arms is going to be infringed and violated and taken away. That's our concern. Okay, cool. Now that we're being honest, right? How do we find a solution where we deal with the fact that people are dying, but we also make sure that the inalienable right to keep and bear arms is not infringed, which I already said earlier, right? But again, that involves what you just said, right? It's compromising. It's not a winner takes all. Listen, I'm not going to give an inch on this, but people are dying. I don't care. They can all die for all I care. That is not a good mindset in any kind of framework of thinking. Is thinking that all 330 million people in this country can die as long as I get to keep my guns. Like, listen, I want to keep my guns just as bad. I don't believe in like registrations and universal background checks, or in the fact that you have to pay the ATF $200 to get a silencer. I don't believe in any of that. But I don't believe that 330 million people should die in order to keep our guns. I think, maybe instead of people dying, what we can do? We can talk. Talking is free. No one dies when you talk, for the most part. I mean, scream fire in a crowded theater, and that might not be the case. But, for the most part, if we're having a conversation inside, for example, the Senate chamber, words will not kill other senators. So we have to, which brings me kind of to the point, right? Which is, our senators are the ones that should be having this type of discussion, because obviously not every single individual, you and I, can't just walk into the Capitol and talk to these people and try to convince them, right? Which again kind of goes back to personal responsibility. I think we're electing the wrong people. We are electing the wrong people, and then we're not holding them accountable. We're not doing our part, right? Because even the founders understood that it's a republic. You choose the representation, which means if they no longer represent you, you need to take them out, remove them, put somebody in there that does represents the needs, wants, and ideas of that specific geographical area that they represent, right? And then the other issue is that we have senators and representatives now that represent the majority that got them elected, but they ignore the minority. Yes, there was a majority in your district that voted you in. What about the other people?
Right.
Are you representing them as well? Because technically you represent them too.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just leave out their concerns, wants, and needs. You can't just leave them out just because they're not in line with the party that you belong to.
Yeah.
You have to make sure that those people's wants and needs are represented as well, right? And so it just kind of goes full circle, right? And in the idea of compromise, right? The compromises don't just have to happen in our private conversations. They have to happen on a public stage, which means we have to elect people that are compassionate and are willing to have these conversations and are listening instead of waiting for their turn to talk and drop a witty zinger that's going to be on C-SPAN. That's not what we need, right? On the left, you have people like Ocasio-Cortez, right? She's one of the poster girls. On the right, you have Matt Gaetz. That's one of the poster boys, right? And they're all about zingers and witty, little one-liners that they're going to throw at each other's. That's not solving homelessness. That's not solving racial inequality. That's not solving police brutality. That is not solving the infringements on our inalienable rights, of which the right to keep and bear arms is just one of them. It's just one. We have many others. They're all kind of being infringed upon. And we're more interested with one-liners, like we're in middle school at the cafeteria. Like, what are we doing, people? Not the politicians we voted in. What are we doing that we're allowing these people to get away with this? We're not even thinking about how, hey guys, let's start a petition to recall that one person because the job they're doing isn't quite cutting it out. Hey, I'm going to go make a TikTok so I can get 1,000 likes. That's easier than doing a petition.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I definitely appreciate your voice. I think, the more that people consume news, I think my perspective is the more that we consume news, the more we need to ask questions, the more we need to question what we're reading and what we're seeing, and not, you shouldn't take everything as the truth. And if something that you don't traditionally align with causes you to question yourself, explore that and look into it a little bit more. So I think that's kind of what I did here. And I appreciate, you educating me more on this. And you know a lot more about the Second Amendment than I do. So I appreciate your, your 2 cents on this.
Well, thank you for having me and letting me ramble on and talk about a whole bunch of stuff. But yeah, definitely kind of like in closing almost. Don't be afraid, there's, to you, to myself, and to everyone, right? Don't be afraid to explore things that initially might make you might make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up because it goes against what you believe. Sit down, take a deep breath, read it, right? And then obviously go in understanding framing, journalistic slant, right? That, the author can slant things to make you feel a certain way, right? Where did they get their data? If there's a study, go read it. Oh, but I'm not scientific. I don't know the math or whatever. Just read it. You'd be surprised how much you can take from a study just by kind of just glossing over it. And that's a good information. Oh, the president said, okay, in what speech? This one speech. Go watch the speech. I don't like listening to Biden. He's constantly rambling and saying weird things. I didn't like listening to Trump either. But guess what? I listened to the speeches because sound bites are a thing, right? Yep. You have to listen to context because context is important. If you take something I said in this interview and you only put a little piece of it outside of context, you're going to make me sound a certain way, right? And so the mainstream media is guilty of this all the time. Fox, CNN, everybody, right? So to everybody, and as a reminder to myself, don't be afraid to look at things that go against what you believe. Be uncomfortable. Be uncomfortable. And be okay with it. And that will make a huge difference in the way that you think, in the way that you perceive things, and how you move forward in your life, and hopefully in your proactivity as and I hope that everyone becomes an advocate for something that they believe in, and they go out there and they educate, they advocate, and they invest time to make that difference.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, I'll definitely keep in touch. I'll let you know when it goes up, and feel free to reach out if you need anything in the meantime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I
All
look
right,
forward to
you have
seeing
a
it.
good one.
You too. Bye-bye.